Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of some of my end of 2021 reading. I need to get caught up. Should we go light to depressing again? Let's do that. So the lightest thing that I read was The Mystery of the Meanest Teacher, which is written by Ryan North and drawn by Derek Charm. This is a DC Comics book that is kind of a joke mystery starring the teenage version of our friend John Constantine there, or John Constantine, because I know that's what they call him in all the TV shows now. As a teenager, going off to boarding school and having adventures with demons. It is very self-aware. His friend here is called Anna, who reveals her real name, which anybody who follows these characters knows who that is. The kind of issue that I had with this, as much fun as I had with it, is that if this is genuinely intended for a middle grade audience to get them into comics, having a reveal that is clearly aimed at adult audiences who have been following these characters for years isn't the best way to do that. I think if you're aiming this at a new audience, the winks to the camera need to be a little more subtle than that, and not, look, it's Santana. So I thought that was slightly irritating if this is actually meant for a middle grade audience. I don't know that it is. I feel like this is for the parents of those middle grade kids who want their kids to read comics. They're not that interested. It's cute and it's funny and it's self-aware. At one point, there's a Hellblazer t-shirt and, there's Hellblazer up there. I don't know that it needed to exist though, but that is true of so many things. I was entertained enough. All right, everything else I have to talk about is depressing, so let's go on with that. So next up, I read Dominik Parisien's Side Effects May Include Strangers. This is a poetry collection. I saw the author on a couple of panels at the Festival of Literary Diversity back in the spring. And this collection of poetry is primarily about pain. And not 100% of the poems are focused necessarily on pain, but even then that is the thread that's running through them. Some of it is an exploration of being young and ill, or just being young, of sexuality, or specifically bisexuality, of disability, of being a francophone in an anglophone space, in a Canadian context, obviously. But within each of these, the theme that's running through it is pain. And I thought it was very successful at exploring that and bringing all of those things together. Because I've definitely read a lot of poetry collections, and I think I've talked about some recently even, where they're trying to bring in a lot of different elements, but the elements don't actually merge together. So you feel like you're getting one poem about one thing and one poem about the next, but that I thought was very successful in interweaving them. Now, stylistically, I don't think this is the style of poetry that is going to be for people who don't read a lot of poetry, but if you do read poetry and you're interested in those themes, then I think it's worth picking up. Next up, actually, this is maybe light. I read Edgy Temelkuran's Together, 10 Choices for a Better Now. So if you've read her, what is it called? How to Lose a Country, the 10 Steps to Dictatorship. This is almost a pairing with that is slightly more optimistic, theoretically, but it's not actually optimistic because it is a lot of her talking to people whose lives have been, she's living in exile in Croatia, so a lot of times she will talk to her neighbors about something and they're kind of like, well, it's better than the war. And or she'll go off to Beirut for a while and have an interesting time, and the other writers will say to her, but it's better than the war. And that doesn't sound like it should be that uplifting, but it is kind of uplifting because the idea is that you can have lived through a civil war in the 80s as a child, as with some of the Lebanese writers she's talking to. You could have lived through a war in the 90s as a teenager, as some of the Croatian and Bosnian writers and neighbors that she talks to. You can be living through an earthquake, and the point is that if you actually survived it, there's still hope for a better tomorrow. So yeah, this is difficult to describe because as I'm saying it, I'm thinking that doesn't sound optimistic in the slightest, but it is actually optimistic. So if you have read How to Lose a Country, I think, and you're despairing, I think this is a nice follow-up. It's also a very quick read, so you have no excuse not to pick it up. Next up, I read Serhii Plokhy's Nuclear Folly, A History of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I had an arc of this from NetGalley, which it actually came out in the spring, but I put off reading it because the introduction section is quite dry. However, The introductory section does not do the rest of the book justice, because once I started reading the actual bulk of the book, it was fascinating. What the author is doing, he's Ukrainian and is a professor at a US university, and he's bringing a lot of recently declassified material from Soviet sources and from Cuban sources into English for the first time. So a big part of this is still the American part of the story, and I think if you have read other books about the Cuban Missile Crisis from a US-American perspective, that material is not going to be new to you, but I think the Cuban and the Soviet material 100% will be. It was fascinating. There's bits about just sailors who didn't know what they were moving, and it's just fascinating the political posturing that caused the Cuban Missile Crisis, and how unnecessary it is, but also how close they all came to blowing up the rest of the world, which is wild. And it's one of these things, you're reading it and we are still here in the 21st century. Obviously, the US and the Soviet Union did not start World War III in the 60s, but reading it, you see how close they got, and it is really fascinating stuff. So I actually thoroughly enjoyed this. I should have read it earlier. The introduction was not representative of the rest of this book. It was top-notch. So if you're a fan of Cold War history, yeah, I thoroughly recommend this. It was very good. So next up, I listened to an audiobook, which was Clayton Thomas-Müller's memoir, Life in the City of Dirty Water, a Memoir of Healing. This has been marketed as being a memoir of an indigenous activist protesting the oil sands, which is very Alberta if you're from Canada. And it is, but only really the final quarter of that is. This is a life memoir. And it's fine as life memoirs go, but I have read a lot of memoirs of people growing up with kind of class instability and in poverty, and with parents who were traumatized by the residential school system and whatnot. And I wasn't 100% surprised that that was what this is, because I had seen Fraser Simons talk about this, and he commented on the fact that it's far more a personal memoir than an activist memoir. As I was listening to it, I was trying not to be unfair and thinking, this is not what I was hoping this was going to be when I put it on hold. And it is interesting in bits and pieces. There are some funny bits. Like, the author had a German stepfather, and they have some funny cultural clash things where like his father and the father's parents came to visit, and being from Europe, they weren't thinking that you have to actually stop at the border, so they ended up being arrested when they crossed into the US when the borders were closed. And it is always hilarious to me that the borders close in the middle, because having spent so much of my life in southern Ontario, where you can cross the border 24 hours a day, I was once stuck in Montana because we crossed the border when I was living in Calgary, and we tried to get back, and the border was closed, so we couldn't go back. We would have had more interesting adventures if we'd just crossed illegally and gotten arrested. If you haven't read a lot of memoirs that are about that set of experiences, somebody growing up in the Canadian prairies and that life, I think this will be a lot more interesting than if you have read other memoirs and are hoping for more oil sands critique. Because I was here for the oil sands critique, and it's just not, that's just not what this is doing. So I think the marketing has done this book a disservice, because I would have probably not read this now. I would have read it in a year or so, because I have read a lot of memoirs this year, and I wasn't looking for another really heavy childhood memoir. I was hoping for the activist memoir, and it's there, but it's not the primary part of this book. If you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought. That's it for now. Ciao.